The millionaire, Jake Thornton, was known in his social circle as someone who had everything. He had wealth, a luxurious lifestyle, expensive cars, and a large mansion. But despite all this, there was one thing that always seemed to elude him: excitement. Every day felt like the same routine, and his friends were equally bored with the predictable nature of their lives. To add some spark to his world, Jake loved taking on bets and challenges. It was his way of adding some thrill to his otherwise perfect existence. One evening, Jake was hanging out with a group of close friends at an upscale restaurant, discussing their usual topics: business deals, travel plans, and the latest trends. But as the conversation began to lull, one of his friends, Mark, made a suggestion that piqued Jake's interest. Mark was known for his wild ideas, and this time, he had something unexpected in mind. He challenged Jake to marry a woman whom Jake wouldn't typically choose. In fact, Mark bet that Jake wouldn't marry a woman who didn't fit the typical model standards of beauty. The terms of the bet were simple. Jake would have to marry a woman who was considered less attractive, in the conventional sense, someone who didn't have the slender body or the picture-perfect appearance often associated with wealth and status. If Jake went through with it, he would win a large sum of money, and of course, gain the respect of his friends for being willing to take on such a challenge. At first, Jake laughed it off, seeing it as nothing more than a silly dare. He was sure he could win easily. He was confident, and the idea of marrying someone outside of the ideal beauty standards didn't bother him at all. After all, it was just a bet. Without much hesitation, Jake agreed to the terms. He was curious to see if he could actually pull it off, and besides, the money was tempting. He figured it would be a simple arrangement. Nothing more than a formal ceremony, a few pictures, and then it would all be over. He didn't expect to develop any real feelings for whoever the woman was. After all, to Jake, this was all just part of the game. The next few days were spent arranging the details of the wedding. Jake's friends helped him find a woman who met the terms of the bet, someone they considered to be the perfect match for such a stunt. They didn't care much about her background or personality. All they were focused on was whether she fit the physical description they had in mind. Little did Jake know, the woman they found was not just any ordinary person. She was someone with her own story, someone who had lived through challenges of her own. But Jake wasn't thinking about any of that. He was just looking forward to winning the bet and getting his money. The day of the wedding arrived, and Jake found himself walking down the aisle, surrounded by a crowd of his friends and family, all watching with curiosity. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the prize at the end. He had no idea that this arranged marriage would turn into something that would change his life forever. In the beginning, he wasn't worried. He figured this would be like every other challenge he faced in the past, easy and predictable. But there was something different about this wedding. It wasn't just about appearances. There was a sense of tension in the air, and Jake could sense that something unexpected was about to happen. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, beauty, and life itself. Her name was Emily Carter, a woman who had spent much of her life embracing who she was, regardless of what others thought. Emily had always been on the heavier side, but that didn't define her. In fact, she was proud of her body and loved herself just as she was. She had learned early on that beauty wasn't just about outward appearances. It was about confidence, kindness, and the way one carried themselves. Despite what society often told her, she knew her worth. Emily had a steady job as a graphic designer, which she loved. She had a close-knit group of friends who adored her for her warm heart and sharp sense of humor. Her family was supportive, and they always reminded her that true beauty came from within. Still, the world wasn't always kind to people like Emily. She had experienced her share of hurtful comments and judgment from others, but she had learned to rise above it. What others thought of her didn't matter. What mattered was how she saw herself. When Jake Thornton's friends approached her with the bet, Emily was initially taken aback. She had heard of Jake and his extravagant lifestyle, and she knew that he was the type of person who never lacked for anything. The idea that a wealthy man would marry her as part of a dare seemed almost unbelievable. It was a strange offer, one that she didn't quite know how to react to. But after thinking it over, Emily decided to go along with it. It wasn't that she wanted to marry Jake, but she felt this strange sense of curiosity about what he saw in her, if anything at all. At the heart of it, Emily wasn't interested in the money or the bet itself. She knew she wasn't some prize to be won. But there was something about the idea of a man like Jake accepting her, even for a brief moment, that intrigued her. Maybe, just maybe, it would be a chance for her to show that she wasn't what people expected. She wasn't going to play along to meet someone else's standards. Instead, she would be true to herself and let Jake decide if he could accept her for who she was, beyond any bet or appearance. The wedding day arrived, and as Emily stood in front of the mirror, she took a deep breath. She wasn't nervous about the wedding itself, but she was curious about how Jake would act. The guests, many of them Jake's friends, had no idea what to expect from her. Emily was determined to show them that she wasn't going to let their opinions affect her. As she walked down the aisle, she held her head high, her confidence unwavering. She had put on her best smile, even though she knew that the marriage was just a game to Jake and his friends. There were whispers as she passed by the crowd, but Emily kept her focus. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. When Jake saw her, his first reaction wasn't what he expected. Sure, he had agreed to this bet, but when he looked at Emily, something inside him shifted. She wasn't just the woman he'd been dared to marry. She was a person with depth, and there was something magnetic about her that made him feel something unfamiliar. For the first time in a long while, Jake found himself not thinking about the money or the challenge, but about the woman standing in front of him. Her presence made him pause, and he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a mistake in accepting this bet. But he quickly brushed the thought aside, not yet ready to admit that maybe this wasn't going to be as easy as he had originally thought. As Emily took her place beside him at the altar, she smiled at him gently, trying not to show the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She wasn't sure what Jake's true intentions were, but she was ready to face whatever came next with her head held high. She had already won, in her own way. She had shown up, and she was going to be true to herself, no matter how the rest of this story unfolded. The wedding ceremony was everything Jake had expected and more. It was lavish, over the top, and full of extravagant details. From the golden decorations to the expensive flowers and the shimmering lights, it felt like the kind of wedding only the wealthiest people could afford. Jake had made sure that everything was perfect, even though he had little emotional investment in the event itself. For him, it was just a formality, a simple way to fulfill the terms of the bet and collect his winnings. His friends were buzzing with excitement, clearly eager to see how the day would unfold. Jake's attention was elsewhere as he waited at the altar. He smiled at the crowd, pretending to be focused, but in reality, his mind was running 100 miles an hour. He was more concerned about how this would all look than about the woman he was marrying. He had no plans to build a relationship with her. This was a game, nothing more. As the music began to play, he watched as Emily walked down the aisle. His friends, who were seated in the audience, whispered to each other, exchanging amused glances. They couldn't wait to see how Jake would handle the situation. He had to marry someone who didn't fit the traditional mold of beauty, and it was clear to them that Emily didn't meet their idea of the ideal woman. Jake couldn't help but notice how calm and composed Emily seemed. She walked down the aisle with a sense of confidence that was impossible to ignore. Despite the whispers and sideways glances, she didn't flinch. She was confident in herself, and it was obvious that she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel uncomfortable. For a moment, Jake felt a flicker of admiration for her courage, but he quickly brushed the thought aside. There was no time for that. After all, this was just a bet, and it was supposed to be about winning. When Emily finally reached the altar, she smiled at Jake, but there was something in her eyes, an understanding, a quiet strength that made him hesitate. This wasn't going to be as simple as he thought. She wasn't a woman who could be reduced to a bet, a mere challenge to win. She was a person with her own dreams, her own thoughts, and a heart that was more than capable of showing love. And yet, Jake had accepted the challenge without giving any thought to the woman standing before him. He was here, and now there was no turning back. The ceremony continued, and Emily kept her focus on the moment, her emotions well hidden. She had agreed to this arrangement for her own reasons, reasons that were not about winning or losing. She had chosen to accept this challenge not as a game, but as a chance to stand tall and show that she was worthy of respect, no matter what anyone else thought. As the vows were exchanged, she did not allow herself to get lost in the moment. She wasn't sure what Jake's true feelings were, and she knew that this marriage, in essence, wasn't real. But what mattered to her was how she handled the situation. Jake, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up with the moment. His usual confidence was beginning to waver. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't just standing next to a woman he barely knew. He was standing next to someone who had a story, who had a presence that demanded attention. As Emily looked at him with calm eyes, Jake couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. He had entered this with a plan, but the reality of the situation was starting to shift. The moment the ceremony ended and they were declared husband and wife, the crowd erupted into applause. Jake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Emily, on the other hand, gave a small but genuine smile. She had kept her emotions in check, but now there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had shown up for herself. The wedding was over, but what came next was still a mystery. Would Jake treat her as just another part of the bet, or was there something more to this unexpected partnership? Only time would tell. But Emily was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had nothing to prove to anyone but herself. After the wedding, things settled into an unexpected quiet. Jake was still processing what had happened, and Emily, though composed, couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside her as well. They had barely exchanged a word since the ceremony, and the first few days after the wedding felt like they were living in two separate worlds. Jake had always been someone who moved quickly from one thing to the next, but now he found himself lingering on thoughts of Emily, her confidence, the way she carried herself so effortlessly. It was strange, but for the first time, Jake was actually starting to question himself. At first, Jake tried to stick to his original plan. He kept his distance from Emily, mostly out of habit. He didn't want to get involved. The bet had been about winning, not about developing any kind of relationship. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore the growing connection between them. There was something about Emily that was different from anyone he had known before. She wasn't impressed by his wealth, his status, or the lavish life he led. She didn't seek approval, nor did she care about his reputation. This was something Jake wasn't used to, and it made him curious. Emily, on the other hand, had her own reasons for sticking with the marriage. She had never believed in doing something just because society said it was the right thing. Marrying Jake had been a strange decision, but she had chosen to see it as a challenge. She wasn't looking for romance or validation from him. She was determined to be true to herself and show him that she wasn't someone who could be dismissed or treated like a bet. But as the days went on, she found herself wondering about Jake's true intentions. Was he just waiting for the marriage to end? Or was he starting to see her in a different light? One evening, Jake invited Emily to dinner at his favorite restaurant, a place known for its exclusivity and elegance. The invitation was casual, almost as if it were just another day in his life. But Emily was cautious. She didn't know if this was another attempt to win her over for the sake of appearances, or if it was something more sincere. She decided to go, but she wasn't going to let her guard down just yet. As they sat across from each other, the conversation started off slowly, awkward even. Jake tried to make small talk about work, his latest business ventures, and the weather. Emily, however, wasn't interested in the typical pleasantries. She wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine, or that she was just another woman who would be impressed by his lavish lifestyle. She politely asked about his family and how he'd been feeling since the wedding. The questions were simple but real. Jake was caught off guard. For the first time, they began to talk about things that weren't about appearances or status. Emily told him about her childhood, her struggles, and the things she had overcome. She spoke about her passion for design and her love for creativity. Jake listened carefully, genuinely intrigued by her words. There was no rush, no pressure to impress each other. For the first time since the wedding, they found a connection that wasn't built on the terms of a bet. As the evening went on, Jake realized that Emily was more than just a woman to be won in a game. She was a person with her own story, her own dreams, and her own way of looking at the world. And to his surprise, he found himself drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. She was different from everyone he had ever known. Real, unpretentious, and deeply kind. Emily, too, found herself looking at Jake differently. She had always assumed that he was just a wealthy businessman, a man who lived for status and luxury. But the more she listened, the more she began to see another side to him, a side that was thoughtful and introspective. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the tension that came from constantly trying to live up to an image. And for the first time, she realized that maybe Jake wasn't just a man who needed to win a bet. Maybe he was someone who needed to learn what it meant to be real. That night, they didn't leave as strangers or even as a couple, but there was something different in the air, a quiet understanding. The bet was still there, hanging over them, but the bond they were beginning to form felt more real than either of them had expected. The next steps were uncertain, but for the first time, they both realized that this was more than just a game. It was an opportunity for something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected started to develop between Jake and Emily. What began as a strange and awkward marriage for the sake of a bet started to evolve into something neither of them could have predicted. At first, they had both kept their distance, each unsure of what the other truly wanted. But as time passed, they found themselves spending more time together, slowly peeling back the layers of their lives, revealing more about who they really were. Jake began to see Emily in a new light. Her confidence was no longer just a characteristic he admired from afar, but something he found himself drawn to. She didn't care about his wealth or his status. In fact, she was rarely impressed by the lavish things Jake had grown used to. She didn't try to win his affection with flashy gestures or compliments. Instead, she simply focused on being herself, and that authenticity was something Jake couldn't ignore. Emily didn't try to change herself for anyone, and that sense of inner strength made her stand out in a world where appearances often mattered more than anything else. One afternoon, they decided to go for a walk in the park. It was a simple plan, but it felt different from the usual fancy outings they attended. There, surrounded by the quiet of nature, they started to talk about things they never had before. They spoke about their hopes and fears, the moments that had shaped them, and the dreams they still held on to. Emily talked about how she'd always wanted to start her own business, a dream she hadn't been able to pursue because of her responsibilities at home. Jake, in turn, shared how he had always been expected to follow a set path, always living up to others' expectations, always needing to prove himself. For the first time, he allowed himself to be vulnerable with someone. As they continued to walk, there was a growing sense of understanding between them. Emily didn't pity Jake, nor did she feel sorry for him. Instead, she saw someone who had been trapped in a cycle of trying to impress the world. She could tell that Jake wasn't entirely happy, even though he had everything that many people would envy. He had the wealth, the fame, and the luxury, but there was an emptiness in his eyes that couldn't be filled by anything external. Jake, on the other hand, started to realize how much he had been missing out on. Emily's perspective was refreshing. She didn't look at the world the way others did. She didn't measure people by the size of their bank accounts or the number of followers they had on social media. Instead, she cared about the person, the character. She didn't judge him for his past or his wealth. She was simply interested in getting to know him, not as the millionaire Jake Thornton, but as Jake, the person. Over time, they began to enjoy each other's company more and more. Jake found himself looking forward to their conversations, enjoying the way Emily could make him laugh or think deeply about things he had never considered. Emily, for her part, found herself drawn to Jake's intelligence, his sense of humor, and his kindness, which she began to see more clearly as they spent time together. She realized that underneath all the wealth and the exterior, Jake was just like everyone else, a person with dreams, flaws, and a need for genuine connection. The more they spent time together, the more they began to question the very premise of their marriage. Was this just a bet anymore, or had it become something more? Emily had originally entered the marriage with no intention of finding romance or love. She wasn't looking for anything from Jake, but now she couldn't ignore the growing bond between them. Jake, too, found himself wondering if there was more to this than he had initially thought. The bet had brought them together, but it was the time they spent getting to know each other that was starting to make a real difference. But despite the feelings they were beginning to develop for each other, neither of them wanted to rush anything. They both knew that the foundation of their relationship had started in an unusual way, and they didn't want to let that define what was happening now. They needed time to figure out what was real and what was just the result of circumstances. Still, it was clear that they were no longer just playing a game. What had started as a marriage for a bet had turned into something neither of them had expected, something more meaningful, more real. The future was uncertain, but they were both willing to see where this new path would take them, unsure of the outcome but open to what it might bring. As the days passed, the changes between Jake and Emily became more noticeable. They were no longer just a couple bound by a strange agreement. They were two people who were genuinely getting to know each other. The dynamic between them shifted. No longer did Jake feel the need to put on a facade. Emily didn't ask him to be anyone other than who he was. In fact, she was the one person who didn't want him to prove anything. It was a freeing feeling for Jake, one he hadn't realized he was craving. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the pressure of living up to expectations. Emily had also begun to feel a shift in herself. She had come into this marriage with the sole purpose of proving something, perhaps to Jake, but also to herself. She wasn't going to be defined by how others saw her. She had always been secure in who she was, but the more time she spent with Jake, the more she realized that this challenge had brought out a side of her she hadn't expected. She had always been confident, but now there was a sense of vulnerability that she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. It was as if the walls she had built to protect herself from judgment were slowly coming down. One afternoon, Jake invited Emily to a private art gallery showing. He knew it wasn't the usual place people would expect him to take a date, but something about the idea of being in an environment that felt quiet and intimate appealed to him. Emily, of course, agreed. She had always loved art, and it was a side of herself she rarely got to explore. As they walked through the gallery, surrounded by beautiful paintings and sculptures, Emily was in awe of how much she enjoyed being there with Jake. The experience felt different than the usual luxurious outings he was accustomed to. This wasn't about money, and it wasn't about appearances. It was simply about enjoying a shared moment, and that was something Emily cherished. As they looked at the art, their conversations deepened. They discussed the emotions each piece evoked, the stories behind the works, and what it meant to express oneself creatively. It was a side of Jake that Emily hadn't seen before. She was used to him being the business-minded, serious man, but here he was, engaged, thoughtful, and willing to share his own perspective on art. She realized that Jake wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was a person with layers, someone who had dreams and thoughts beyond his public image. Emily found herself fascinated by his insights, and Jake, in turn, was intrigued by her perspective. She saw things differently, and that was something he appreciated. By the time they finished their tour of the gallery, they were both lost in conversation, discussing everything from life goals to the importance of art in their lives. It wasn't a romantic date in the traditional sense. There were no grand gestures, no extravagant displays. Instead, there was a simple, genuine connection. They both felt a sense of peace as they left the gallery. It wasn't the kind of night that would be remembered for the extravagant or the flashy, but it was one that would stay with them because of how it made them feel in that moment, seen, understood, and valued. Over the next few weeks, they continued to spend time together, enjoying the quiet moments that often went unnoticed in the rush of their lives. Jake invited Emily to dinner at his favorite restaurant, but this time it wasn't for show. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about enjoying a meal together, discussing everything from their past experiences to their future dreams. Emily started to feel more at ease around Jake, and he, in turn, began to open up more than he ever had before. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of Jake's house overlooking the city lights, Emily spoke up, breaking the silence between them. "You know, Jake," she began softly, "I never thought I'd end up in this situation. I didn't expect any of this to be real. But now, I'm not sure what I was expecting when I agreed to this bet. I thought it was just a challenge. But now, it feels like it's something more." Jake turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. He had been thinking about it too, but he wasn't sure how to put his feelings into words. "I know what you mean," he said after a moment. "At first, I thought it was just a game. But now, I realize that it's been a lot more than that. I've learned a lot more about myself in these few weeks than I ever thought I would." Emily smiled at him, and for the first time, Jake saw a glimpse of the woman who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. She wasn't just the confident, independent woman he had first met. She was someone who had allowed herself to grow and change, and he admired her for that. It was in that moment that Jake realized something he hadn't expected. He had feelings for Emily. Not because of the bet, not because of what anyone else thought, but because of who she was as a person. She was real. As the weeks went by, Jake and Emily found themselves increasingly comfortable with each other. What had started as an awkward, forced marriage for the sake of a bet had turned into something that neither of them could deny was becoming more meaningful. Their connection was no longer just about the bet. It wasn't about proving something or keeping up appearances. It was about two people who had come together and were now learning to understand each other in a way neither of them had expected. Jake, once a man obsessed with wealth and success, had started to let go of the walls he had built around himself. Emily didn't care about his fortune or his reputation. She cared about the real Jake, the one who showed vulnerability, who laughed at simple jokes, and who enjoyed the quiet moments just as much as the extravagant ones. The more time they spent together, the more Jake realized how much he had been missing in his life. All his wealth had never brought him the peace or fulfillment that sitting in silence with Emily could. The way she was so at ease in her own skin, the way she wasn't afraid to speak her mind, was something that Jake admired more than he cared to admit. For Emily, things had also shifted. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this. At the start, she had entered this marriage with a sense of purpose, to prove to herself and others that she wasn't going to be judged based on her appearance. She had assumed that this marriage was just a formality, something she would endure, and that she would leave it unchanged. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself enjoying Jake's company more than she had anticipated. They shared so many moments, from deep conversations about their pasts to quiet walks around the city. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but rather a slow burn, a relationship built on mutual respect and understanding. One evening, they decided to take a trip out of the city, something they had both been craving. They chose a small cabin in the woods, far from the chaos of their usual lives. The quiet serenity of the place allowed them to relax and enjoy each other's company without distractions. For the first time, it felt as though they could breathe freely, with no expectations hanging over them. They spent the day hiking, enjoying the beauty of nature, and just talking about life. Jake was surprised by how much he enjoyed being outside, away from the pressure of his usual high-paced world. Emily, too, felt at peace, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the trees and the birds. That night, they sat outside on the porch, watching the stars. There was a calm in the air, and for once, they didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. They simply sat together, each lost in their thoughts, yet completely present in the moment. Emily couldn't help but smile, thinking about how far they had come. From the awkward wedding to this peaceful night in the woods, their journey had taken unexpected turns. But now, she realized, it wasn't just about the circumstances that had brought them together. It was about the genuine bond they had started to form. Jake, too, had been reflecting on how much his feelings had changed. He looked at Emily, who was staring up at the sky with a peaceful expression, and for the first time, he didn't just see her as the woman he had married for a bet. He saw her as someone who had become a part of his life, someone he valued in ways he hadn't anticipated. There was a softness in the way she looked at the world, an openness that made him want to be better. Better for her, better for himself. "It's crazy how things have turned out," Jake said softly, breaking the silence between them. Emily turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "Yeah, I didn't expect any of this. I thought it was just a game, but now..." She trailed off, unsure of how to finish her thought. Jake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Me neither. I think we've both learned something along the way." Emily nodded, her heart swelling a little. It was true. What started as a bet, a challenge, had turned into something far more meaningful. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, they weren't scared of it. They had created something real, something that neither of them had been looking for, but both of them had needed. The next morning, as they packed up to leave the cabin, neither of them rushed. They took their time, savoring the peacefulness of the moment. There was a quiet understanding between them. No more games, no more pretenses. They had come to realize that while they hadn't expected much out of this marriage, they had found something that neither of them had anticipated. A connection. And maybe, just maybe, this unexpected journey was just the beginning of something even more meaningful. The days that followed were filled with a quiet yet undeniable sense of change. Jake and Emily, once two people who had barely known each other, had now formed a connection that neither of them had expected. The awkwardness that once defined their relationship had faded, replaced by a growing sense of understanding and trust. Their marriage, which had begun as a challenge, was now evolving into something real, something neither of them could deny. Emily, for the first time, felt truly seen. Jake had shown her a side of himself that few people ever got to see. He had let go of the image he had spent years perfecting. He wasn't the wealthy businessman anymore, constantly battling to keep up appearances. Instead, he was simply Jake, someone who laughed easily, who made mistakes, and who didn't mind showing a little vulnerability. That was something Emily respected more than anything. She had never expected to find someone like him, someone who was willing to break down the walls that most people built around themselves. And the more time she spent with him, the more she began to admire him, not for his wealth, but for his willingness to grow. For Jake, Emily had become more than just a woman he had married for a bet. She was someone who made him think, who challenged him in ways no one else ever had. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, and that honesty had a way of cutting through the noise of his world. He had always surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, but Emily wasn't interested in playing that game. She told him the truth, even when it was hard, and that was something he valued deeply. One evening, they sat together on the balcony of Jake's apartment, looking out at the city lights. It was a quiet moment, one that seemed to stretch on forever, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt completely at peace. He had spent so many years chasing after things, money, success, recognition, but none of those things had ever brought him the sense of fulfillment that he had now, sitting next to Emily. The bet, which had seemed like such an important part of their lives in the beginning, now felt distant, like a far-off memory. What mattered now was the present, the connection they had built, and the potential for what could come next. Emily glanced over at Jake, noticing the calmness in his eyes. She had never seen him look this way before. There was no tension in his posture, no anxiety about what the future might hold. He was simply present, and it was a feeling that made her heart swell. She had been so focused on proving herself in the past, on showing that she was more than just her appearance. But now she didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. She had found someone who understood her, who saw her for who she truly was, and that was more than enough. As the night went on, their conversation shifted toward the future. They talked about their hopes, their dreams, and what they wanted out of life. It wasn't about big plans or grand gestures. It was about the little things, the quiet moments they had shared, the lessons they had learned, and the path they hoped to walk together. They didn't know where their journey would take them, but for the first time, neither of them felt afraid. They had already come so far, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The following weeks were filled with more of these quiet moments. They continued to learn from each other, to grow together, and to build a life that was theirs. They traveled, went on adventures, and shared the simple pleasures that life had to offer. And through it all, they never forgot the beginning, the bet that had brought them together. But as time went on, it became clear that it had been just the start of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. It wasn't the fairy tale ending that many people might have expected. There were no grand gestures, no perfect moments. But what Jake and Emily had was something far more meaningful. They had a partnership built on trust, respect, and a deep understanding of one another. It was the kind of bond that didn't rely on wealth or status, but on the connection they had forged through shared experiences. In the end, they both realized that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them. They had started with a bet, but they had ended up with something much more valuable, a love that was real, genuine, and built to last. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together.